Okay, so I've been going to be doing something slightly different with this watch today. So I've been repairing a couple of these, and I picked this up at a charity shop in Stirling. So I thought what I'd actually do is I'd record me repairing it, for those who are interested. So this is a Smiths Empire watch. I imagine it's from the 60s or so, I don't really know. It's difficult to tell on these things because they've got such a wide span. Largely, they're very similar, but what stands this one apart is the second sub-dial. Now you recognise most pocket watches and other watches have their second hand indeed right in the middle, but this one has it down at the bottom there. That's largely because of their technology at the time. It was easier to create it and have it down the bottom rather than create the gearing to send it through the middle shaft. So we know it's an older watch, we know it's an older in design watch. I have done one of these Smiths ones before, but this is the first time doing one with a dial down the bottom there. So you can see it's a non-runner. I've tried the winding mechanism, and unfortunately it isn't having it. Basically, it's quite happy to sit there and not wind. So the first thing is to open the back of it and get the old tweezers. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play with that balance wheel there and see if I just can't convince it to tick. Now you see that swings back and forth. It's quite a good sign, really. It means it's all freed off, but that is what controls the power, of course, and that ticking, that tick-tock, tick-tock, is what effectively gives you your seconds. So if that's not spinning, the power isn't getting through to that. So the way to think of it is a large, powerful spring that's basically trying to unwind the entire mechanism, which would spin the handles around rapidly fast, but it is being held off by that balance wheel there. So because that's not moving, it's not going to send anything around. So what we have to do is take the movement out. Now these ones are actually quite interesting in that they come out the front. So we have to take off this crystal. Now I'm using this particular knife because it's very short and it's also very stout. I used to have a proper case opening tool, but unfortunately I've lost it. And this is what surprised me straight away, is when I took that off, that is actually silver. You can see it's clear as day. It's just, yeah, it's nice and silver. It looks lovely, really. Which means all that yellowing colour has come out of the crystal. As you can see there, it's a horrible stained yellow colour. Now, I'm not sure if they coloured these, but because of the inconsistency of it, I'm going to say it's probably more reaction with light, or UV light as I should say, and maybe even a bit of tobacco smoke over the years. So I'm going to try giving that a play with later. But for now, we're just going to continue taking the watch to pieces. Now you can see we've got these 4 screws in the front here. I'm actually taking out the first one. The first one's already come out, sorry. And I'm just going to take out the further 3, and that is going to release that bezel, which is, the actual, I suppose it's the actual chassis of the pocket watch, you might want to call it. And that'll release the works, which is what we're interested in playing with. Now, it's quite an interesting mechanism on how it works with these watches, because the crown, which is the bit stood out at the top, which actually wind, isn't actually connected to the watch, to the workings of the watch anyway. So in a normal wristwatch or in many pocket watches, that is what's called a stem, which is a stem which goes straight through from the outside to inside. With these, they're actually sprung loaded, so that you have to push it down to engage it with the actual pocket watch, which I thought was quite a fascinating mechanism. And it took me by surprise the first time I tried to take one out anyway, because I was trying for the life of me to figure out how to take the stem out, and then it turns out you don't have to. And you see it's just as easy as that, and then that pops the entire inside out. And now you can see we've got the entire works of the watch. So with that out, we really need to look at getting these handles off first. Like I say, we've got to come in through the front, so to do that we've got to take the faceplate off. So what I'm doing is I'm putting in, well, it's just a polythene food bag. I'm laying that over and then I'm tweezing through the bag to lift the handle off. The reason you do that is so you don't make an awful marring mess at the front. I don't know why, but the plastic helps too. There are specialist tools that you can get to actually lever these off with, or even little pinch removal tools, and they're quite fantastic. I might have to get some at some point, but for now I don't mind just slotting in with these very sharp tweezers. Another upside of using this bag, as you can see, is they're just friction fit on there, but when they pop, they do tend to go. I tell you for free, you'd rather not have that ping into next week. I don't know how many times I've said to myself, and I'll say to anybody who asks, but it's always a good idea to vacuum before doing something like this. Because if, and inevitably when, a handle flies off, you get a chance to see it easier anyway. So this face, unlike most, especially a lot more expensive watches, is just held on with these 4 little bent tabs. Now you've got to be dead careful with these really, because it's only very thin aluminium. Oh, I say it's aluminium, I assume it is. And if you're not very careful, you'll just fatigue these and snap them straight off. So it does indeed look like just a big pressed bit of alley. And then we're straight underneath, we've got this thrust washer here, and all that does, I'll just take that off, and all that does is hold on the hour wheel. That's the one I'm removing there, so called because it has the hour hand. Underneath that steel looking gear is called the crown pinion. You can remove those with a crown pinion tool. They are a press fit on there. Unfortunately I don't have a crown pinion tool, but you could get them. I don't know if you saw it was ticking then, but that's implying what I already knew, is that there's a large amount of wind already in the watch. Now that little window there that I was sticking my tweezers through allows access to a little ratchet basically, which holds on the spring. So by sticking my tweezers through there, I'm able to pull back the ratchet and let down that main spring. If you didn't do, you'd open it up and all that spring energy would be released in a second and it'd fire itself most of the way into next week. Now, not being a professional, obviously, I'm recording this with my phone and I'm actually narrating over the top afterwards. And that's leading with this particularly fantastic camera view of my finger. But like I say, I'm only trying to indicate an idea as to what I'm doing, rather than give a step-by-step, for instance. So what I'm removing here is in fact the only bridge on this watch. So most modern watches, you've got like a chassis, and then you put a gear on and it's got a bridge, which is a bit of formed metal which goes over the top of it and keeps that gear in. And then you go to another gear and it's got another bridge. These watches are not like that at all. They are much simpler in production, much more of a pain in the arse to work on, to be honest, for a lot of reasons. But for a lot of other reasons, they're much simpler too, basically because they haven't got a lot in them. But regardless of reasoning, the truth is still the same. They have only got the one bridge, which is what this part is here I'm removing. As I say, all that does is retain the that mainspring. One thing you may notice straight away in this watch as well is the lack of crystals. Now, a lot of modern watches have got 17 jewels written on them, for instance, or 15 jewels. And what that's referring to are the little ruby-looking jewels which sit on the end of the gears. So I'm just removing that look, there you go, and that is the mainspring underneath there. So sorry, the jewels I'm referring to are synthetic sapphire, actually, coloured ruby colour to make them match what they always have done. These old watches are nothing of the sort. They're good old-fashioned British Sheffield steel. And there you go, I'm just showing off that ratchet mechanism again to say that's what I was pulling in to let down that mainspring so it didn't fire itself into next week. And here we're going to have a bit of a closer look at this mainspring. I'm going to be using the old tweezers shoved in there to try and separate it, and you'll have like the anvil on the inside, which is what effectively transfers the power into the water workings, and then you've got the spring which retains the power and the spring casing. So to talk across myself once more, sorry, I was talking about the jewels. So they're synthetic sapphire, coloured ruby colour, and what they are is an incredibly hard, they're an incredibly hard crystal. So on the scale with diamond being 10, I believe they're around about 9. So they're pretty much hard as woodpecker lips, and the steel shafts are around about 7. The theory being is that you don't want to wear out the chassis of a watch, because you can replace the jewels, you can replace the gears, but the chassis is the most expensive part. So you put those jewels in and then drop a bit of oil on them. These watches are not as precision instruments as those. They're a lot more agricultural, you may say. So they've got old-fashioned steel on steel with a load of oil in it. They're just coming back to this mainspring here. You can see that I've wound out the mainspring using just my thumbs, and what I'm indicating there is the mechanism which effectively holds the spring on. So it's a little divot coming out of that case, and it's a fold on that spring there to effectively keep it there. Now, with an automatic watch, sorry, I'll hold on just a moment there while I'm just showing you what I'm doing here. What I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get the watch to move by hand. So I'm putting a load of force on it, and unfortunately it's not going anywhere. So we know it's dead, but it was stuck anyway. So an automatic watch doesn't actually have these divots coming out the inside of the spring case. What they've got in something called braking grease, which is grease which gives just the right amount of friction so the spring can go round and round and round, and theoretically speaking you could never overwind a watch. Now with these, they get stuck and people wind and wind and wind and wind and wind it, and eventually something's got to give, and normally it's that spring which fails, which is how you can overwind these old pocket watches. Now, you've got to really go for it. You've got to really chuck some ignorance at it to get to that point, but there we go. That's why you cannot overwind an automatic watch. Even when it's on your wrist going round 10 to the dozen for years and years, it'll never overwind. So all I'm doing is I'm removing here the large back of these watch workings. I don't know if you'd call this a bridge because it's got multiple things going into it, but I'm removing the screws. It's only 4 screws, and then it's the entire rear of the watch comes off. And here's where you're going to realise just how simple these old Smiths watches are. Now one thing you do have to be mindful of is this part that I'm taking out here. I don't know the proper name for this, but this is what actually connects to the crown. So you'll see as I lift it there, it helped itself out because it is indeed sprung loaded. And ask me how I know it's sprung loaded is because I've had one fire across the room. As I say, I've worked on something similar before. Now, I'm trying to remove this here, and you can see that everything's rather stuck together. And that's the first alarm bell that we've got something wrong here. Because I'm trying to remove this, all of the gears should effectively just fall out. And they're not. They're all sticking together. So I'm just removing that, and I'm also taking great pains to try and make sure that balance wheel doesn't get knackered. The wheel itself should be fine, but if you look on there, you've got what's called a hairspring, which is an incredibly fine part. It is no thicker than the width of a human hair, hence it being called a hairspring. If that goes, the entire watch is dead. And the only way that's going to go is if I try and remove it and fuck it up, basically. So you see now we're on the inside of the watch, and here we are. We've got the main gear, and then we've got the minute and second gears, and then we've got the release wheel, and we've got the fork. And what I'm showing you here is the awful state of the inside of this watch. Now, these watches cease because the oil in them goes hard. That's the long and short of it. And what I was showing you there is this watch has been warm at some point, not hot, just warm, someone's pocket, somewhere like that, and the oil evaporates and it coats the entire inside of the watch. And that is basically what goes down on all of these. And I was just trying to show that that's why these stop. And you'd be surprised just how easy it is to stop one of these things. Because like I say, you've got that mainspring with a lot of force in. But each one of those wheels, that force gets reduced and reduced and reduced. So by the time you get to the end, it's such a very small amount of pressure required to stop that mainspring. And what I'm trying to indicate here is the parts that I cannot remove. As I say, you need a crown puller to get that middle one out, which I don't have, which I could get. Probably will do at some point if I keep doing these, but we will see. And then we've got those other 2 wheels. Now those other 2 wheels are unfortunately riveted in, but they're not actually key and central to the works. They're actually for the time interval, just the minute and hour adjustment. So we're not too concerned about those. What I have here is some 90% isopropyl alcohol, and I'm going to be soaking every part of this watch in it, basically, to try and soften up that horrible oil which has turned into a braking grease across the entire watch. Now, I have had success with just leaving the works in there without disassembling it, and that'll get a watch running again for, I don't know, about a week, maybe 2, and then it'll start slowing down, and eventually it'll stop. So what I've learned to do from that is do the hardest thing first, because it's normally what you end up having to do anyway, and just drop it all in there and leave it in there. Now you can get ultrasonic cleaners, of course, which I used to own, and I might get another one, not particularly expensive in the grand scheme of things, and they work brilliantly for something like this. We can get proper watch component cleaners, which is a very, very fine mesh basket, and you drop it into a surfactant similar to what you'd put in a ultrasonic cleaner, and it's an automated machine which actually spins it back and forth, and that will get all the horrible old grease off. But obviously I'm just some Joe Blogs playing around at home, so I'm not going to do that. So talking about cleaning, we're going to have a quick look over the face, and I'd say this watch has never been apart. I looked on the inside of the rear cover and there was no dates, no watchmaker's mark or anything like that, so I'd go as far to say it hasn't been taken apart. So this face was incredibly clean. So what I'm doing is I'm just giving it a very mild rub, and I'm getting the smallest amount of rubbish come off it, but yeah, not a lot at all. One thing to bear in mind with these is that I'm only using water here, warm water specifically, to clean the face. I'm not using any alcohol or anything like that, because that is just a screen printed face. And yeah, I found out the hard way that those screen printed faces do just come off with a bit of alcohol. So it turns, rather from a precision instrument, into a just an idea of time, sort of against the entire proposal of a watch. So you look at those pips all over, all around on the hours. So you've got a 2 on the 12 and then 1 through 11 again. And that isn't loom on there. I did check and double check, and I didn't see any evidence it was loom. I think it's just an indicator on there. So there you go, proudly made in England, and it's lovely and shiny. So I'm just trying to take a couple of hairs which seem to be stuck on the face of this. I thought they were from myself, but I'm actually now starting to think that they're probably from when the watch was made for a start, because I can't seem to remove them for love nor money. And well, I didn't want to knacker the face purely because of that. So off the back of what I was saying earlier, we're now going to have another look at this crystal. Now, I used to think that the crystal was something completely separate, but it is not. It is just the glass looking bit in the middle. But this is not glass, this is plastic. And you might be thinking, what the hell is he doing with that tube of toothpaste? But don't worry about it yet. So toothpaste is an incredibly fine abrasive. We use it on our teeth. It's an abrasive. It'll fill in any potential pores or gaps that we have, and that's what I'm using it for here. And what I was trying to indicate is I'm just going to use it on the one side, try and indicate the difference of what we get. And I don't know if you can tell the before and after, but it is actually a little bit smoother after only a few seconds. And one thing you'll also notice is the fact that unfortunately the bezel which goes around came off. I'm not too concerned about that, because we can refit it. So after a little bit more time polishing with the old toothpaste, and you can see now that has got a very nice uniform finish all over it. It's always surprising to me quite how good a finish you can get. But one thing which has not gone, it's gone a little bit, but it's not got much better, is that unfortunate staining. I wouldn't mind if it was uniform, but you can see that it goes all over. Now you can actually get new crystals, and they're about, I don't know, about 5 or something like that, not dreadful. But I thought, well, it's got the original watch, it's all original, so I'll put it back on and I'll see what we're like. And I don't know how it was originally fixed, but what I'm using here is an incredibly small amount of CA glue, so super glue. That's what I'm going to be using to refix that crystal. And you can see I'm just putting on the smallest amount, and I'm using a cut cotton bud as a applicator, just to get it as fine as I can, to keep it nice and controlled. You don't want to go too far with this CA glue, because it can react badly with some plastics. It can fog them, make them go cloudy, or in some extreme circumstances it can actually put that much stress and pressure on the plastic, it can crack it. But luckily in this scenario, with the small amount I've used, we haven't had that issue, and just in those few seconds, as you've seen, that's now quite confidently held. I'm just making sure that I haven't glued something to the front of it. Luckily I haven't done, so that's that done and out of the way. So there's been a bit of a jump and cut here, but in the meantime of all that, we've been soaking this stuff for ages, and I seem to want to show you about the fact that I'm cutting off that gluey end for the next bit, I presume. So this has been soaking in there for a couple hours now, And it's about time we looked at, well, sorting it all out and getting it put back together. The first thing we're going to take out is that bridge for the mainspring. So it's been soaking in there, and you can see, I don't know if you can see, I'm sure I'm going to zoom in just a moment. There you are. So you can see it doesn't actually look completely awry, it looks basically as it was. And then you start taking a cotton bud to it, and then you realise just how filthy the inside of this bloody watch is. And look at that already, look. And this really does make a difference soaking it in isopropyl alcohol, because it not only dissolves it from the faces, it also dissolves it from the holes where the bloody where the pivots go, which is where it needs to be gotten out of, basically. So strictly speaking, I wouldn't need to clean the faces unless they've got a moving part on them. That particular one does, but I decided to anyway, because there's just another chance that grease can get airborne, and then it's just going to get back into the watch, and then we're back to square one. So this spring, I've taken out, and it looks quite good condition. I'm not sure if it might have even been replaced at some point, because I haven't seen one look like that on all blued and everything as well. And then I'm going to take out the case for the mainspring, and again, these are normally chock full of crap, so it's a pain in the arse to get these clean normally. And you can see that this has actually got some corrosion on it. If I was in a ultrasonic cleaner, that corrosion might have come off, but it's not hurting anybody, so I'm not going to get too concerned. And it's the same about the inside here as well. All that is worn off steel which is stuck to the brass. It's not actually part of it, of course, but it's stuck to all the same. So we've got the main back here of the works, and you can see just how filthy that can get. And although I clean things here, chances are I'll probably give it another clean before I put it on camera. Put it on the watch rather. You can see I've sped things up somewhat, just because this takes a while to get everything good and clean, and this is quite a nice piece where you can see as I clean it just how bad it was to start off with. And these things are bloody filthy. So I'm just going through piece by piece, and you'll notice this is the adjuster. I've slowed the video down again just to show you this briefly. All I'm showing you here is the fact that these are indeed handed. You see that side has an almost cancellation, and then I'm going to show you the other side. He says no cancellation. That's very important, because it turns out that makes a difference. I don't know why they decided to make it handed, but it is, and believe you me, it can take a while to figure out when you don't know. But these things are sent to triers. So all of these wheels, I'm not really too interested in cleaning the faces of them, because they've got no movement on them whatsoever. I have that little thrush washer just because I wanted it to be clean. What I'm really interested in cleaning on these are the pivots, which are the little shaft-like pieces stuck out. So what I'm doing is rolling a cotton bud over those in an effort to try and keep playing with them to a bare minimum, because the last thing you want to do is bend them. If you bend them, then it's basically going to write the watch off. These watches aren't expensive, so it's worth doing if it's got some sentimental value about it. But by the same token, just because something doesn't cost a lot financially doesn't mean there's point in destroying it. It just means it's very unlikely that you'd pay a lot of money to get the bits for it. Like. So the oil I'm going with here is a very light machine oil. It's quite a stable oil, synthetic based, very similar to a 3-in-1. And what I'm going to go through and do here is I'm just going to lubricate the insides of all these, you'd call them jewels on a proper watch, but I don't know what you'd call them here. I suppose you'd call them pivot balls, something like that. I don't know. I'm just going to lubricate those, so when we put the pivots in, they've already got some oil to sit in, so they're not going to be running dry. Now, it's not like a camshaft on a car. It's not going to write it off if you run it dry until the oil gets there. But it's just to give it a little bit of a hand starting up, because these things can be a little bit of a pig to get started. So the first piece that we're going in with here is the pallet fork. Now we know that slotted hole there with the adjuster is where the pivot goes in, or where the balance wheel goes in rather. So we know that the pallet fork is going to be going onto there. And like I say, the pallet fork is really what's going to be controlling the watch, especially with this wheel here. You can see that it's got a series of large slots in with angles, and there's 2 pins on the back of the pallet fork. And what that does, it allows the pallet fork to pivot one way and drop into one side of the slot, and then when it pivots the other way, it drops into the other side of another slot. And what that means is every time it goes back and forth, it will spin that wheel a calibrated amount. It's calibrated to roughly a second. That's why you get tick-tock, tick-tock, which happens about a second. What we're going to do here is just assemble the rest of the train, with that last wheel there being the minute wheel. Called the minute wheel because that shaft actually protrudes through the face of the watch, and that is what the minute hand goes on. And now we've got the hardest part, arguably the hardest part of the reassembly process, is putting this face on. With a small automatic watch, or a small manual wind wristwatch anyway, this is a more laborious process, but it's easier. This is the exact opposite of that. It's less laborious, but it's much more difficult, because instead of having to line up just 1 or maybe 2 shafts, pivots to line up the holes, we've got to line up 5 and the main wheel and then that balance wheel as well. When I was playing with this, I actually learnt there is an easier way to do to set that balance wheel, which if I ever do another video I may show you. Historically I've just balanced it all up and I've aligned them all up and then just got lucky, I suppose, but this one presented some real issues and I had to think a little bit more laterally. I don't know if you noticed, but there is a big brass needle, which is what that hairspring connects onto. You can see I'm just playing near it there. And in the centre you've got which looks like a steel pin. Now I thought that steel pin was a rivet to hold that needle on. That needle sets the timing of the watch, by the way. Turns out it isn't. That steel pin is indeed a shaft with a cup, which is what holds the underside of that balance wheel. So what I found out you can do is you can remove that shaft altogether, and that way you can assemble the watch without worrying too much about the balance wheel. All you've got to worry about is the shaft, and then when it's all screwed up and tightened up, you can connect it together afterwards. Which, believe you me, is a much, much easier way of doing it rather than what I'm doing here, which is playing with it. And there's a jump cut shortly, which is basically when I decided, look, there's got to be an easier way of doing this. And it turns out the easier way is actually the more difficult way. As I say, do the hardest thing first, because it's normally what you end up having to do anyway, and you'll just save yourself some time in the long run. But I get there in the end eventually. You can see that there's just a lot of playing to get it all lined up. Lots and lots of playing. So here we are, it looks like we're all together and we're all screwed in. I'm just indicating the fact that I put that in as well, showing the castellated side. It can only go in one way around. And you see that screw there, that's the other side of that pin with the cup. So what you do is you'd pull that pin out, you'd drop that balance spring in there, and you'd chuck the pin in, and this screw head on there sets tension on the balance wheel. So you want it to be tight enough so it's not rattling around all over the place, and it's got a nice lovely concentric parallel spring back and forth, but you don't want to put on so much tension that it holds it steady. And it's just a nice adjustment method. So now you can see what I'm doing is I'm attempting to put some tension on the gear train just by hand, and it's ticking, it's alive. That's the bad thing about these watches. With a normal wristwatch, you can assemble it all, and the last thing to go on is the balance wheel and the balance bridge. So you can actually get it all on, get it all assembled, put some tension in it, and then you drop it on and it bursts straight into life. But with these, it's you've got to make your own fun. So what I'm doing here, so I'm reassembling the spring, the main spring, back into the cup there. What I'm doing is I'm lining up the notch with the fold on that spring, and then I'm just going to walk it in. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm pushing my thumb one side, guiding the spring around with my finger, and then putting my thumb on the other side. So no matter what, I've always got at least one of my thumbs on the top of that spring. The last thing you want is that sending off, because like I say, it's nice and big, you'll find it. It's just if you find it in one piece and unmangled. Now you can get proper tools to spring all these up, and what I'll do is it'll bunch it up really tight, and then got like a syringe action and you just sort of push it straight in, but there's no need because obviously I've done it all. Now this mainspring, it's got a slot right at the end there, and that slot aligns with, you guessed it, the anvil. You see it's got a little notch there, and that's so the two key together. So when you wind it, that anvil picks up on the spring and actually puts the tension in. Really simple, and that just clicks together like that, and it's all good to go. That's one thing that can be said about this watch in its entirety. It is just simple. It is simple from start through finish. You can see with this, we've got a bit of a handing scenario. So you've got that hole there it's going through, and you can see that if I was to put it one way up, it wouldn't fit. But the other way up, it's got almost like a spacer, so we know that it's going to fit. And that's indeed the way that I've just put it in there. So connecting it back up to that ratchet, which I was playing with earlier, you can see that it is indeed seated properly because it does go all the way through. And you can even put a couple of clicks on it, and that should hold it just about there. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to chuck on this mainspring bridge. So I'm just going to give it a quick dab of oil before I do that. Like I say, when you're oiling these watches, or when I'm oiling these watches anyway, it is a real priority to put on as small of amount of oil as you can. You really, really don't want a lot. All you're trying to do is keep those pivots wet and give them something to tick inside of. You don't want to put too much on there because it'll either run, or when it gets warm it'll vaporize, and then we'd be right back to square one. So that's what we want. We want a nice high temp stable oil as well. You can get proper oils made by Mobile for this. You can get proper oils and greases. As far as I can tell, they're very similar to what I've got here. If I was doing a really expensive unit, then of course you'd invest in the right stuff. But these are workhorse watches anyway, so they want something which is going to effectively last a while, and something which is going to do the job for a long time. It is a precision instrument. It's precision-ish instrument. It's not a Speedmaster, is it? You're not going to be timing the moon landing with it. But yeah, it's a precision enough instrument, but it's all a case of scale. So is it made to the 10th of thou? No, it probably isn't. Will it work? Absolutely right. It's like an old diesel engine. Doesn't need that much love, care or attention, but believe you me, it'll tick for 100 years. Unless, of course, you leave it in a drawer somewhere. It's like it just likes to be run. So it's quite a fantastic shot at the back of my hand there, but now that's out of the way, I'll just bring it back for a moment, just so you're not used to it. I always like to try and do them up in series like you would do with anything. You can see it runs now. Oh, sorry, put the screws in now, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to manually put some tension on that mainspring, and I'm just going to play with the tension on that balance wheel. Now the watch is running. So like I say, you can do it up by hand. It's the exact same as doing it through the gear train with the crown wheel. And I'm just going to keep playing with the tension on that balance wheel until I'm happy. I suppose the only downside of setting the watch up in this manner is that you need to effectively set it back up again. If you didn't do, you didn't do, but now it's set back up, you can see, well, effectively it wants to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around here and I'm just going to lubricate the backs of these. Obviously I got them from the inside, but I haven't got them on the backs or on the faces. I'm just going to go through with a very, very small amount of oil. And I think this watch has probably run a while. I think that hairspring is probably a little bit weak because it's very on off. You do get it with these old watches particularly, to be fair. There's a thing with a watch called impulse, which is how much force, it's like torque or horsepower, how much force is being imparted onto that balance wheel. And with these old watches, you don't get a lot of force at all. Like I say, they normally tick about once a second, but a very modern mechanical watch, you'd have multiple ticks a second with a very strong impulse. These aren't too bothered about that, so they are quite, I suppose I've been saying they're a bit agricultural, but in that regard they're quite fine. It's a bit of a dichotomy with that regard, but still. She'll run. I know she'll go. If she starts doing it, she'll wear it eventually. So sometimes they need to just need to let the oil wet through, stuff like that. Need to let the oil wet through to the cups, to the shafts and the pivots, and eventually it'll just kick into life, and then that'll be it gone. And then one of those things, you just need to run it, and it'll get better and better. So you can see already, just with a bit of oiling and a little bit more setting up on that balance wheel, we've got a watch which is now back alive again. It's just ticking, and that's it now. It'll go for another 60 years, as long as someone keeps winding it anyway. So I suppose what we have to do here is carry on our lubrication, and let's look at putting it back together. So what I'm doing here is I'm just lubricating these 3 raised points. Now these 3 raised points, you'll understand the use of those in just a moment when I put the hour wheel back on. Oh no, I'm not quite as far through as I thought. Like I said, I'm narrating this after the fact, so something must have caught my eye here. I'm not sure exactly what, but I thought I was about ready to start reassembling the rest of this watch, so I can't remember why I decided to take it back on myself, just to make sure everything looked okay. I'm looking back on here from the second time, and I know it's okay, but there we are. I think what I'm doing here is I'm just lubricating the wheels relating to the time setting to make sure they're okay. And yeah, they seem okay, they seem fine, but they're not too important anyway, really, but it's always good to check these sorts of things. And there we go. She's a ticking watch. It's alive. So with the works going, it's time to put this back together. Put it back together from a piece of clockwork into an actual watch. Now this is the hour wheel, again so called because it's what the hour hand goes on. That crown pinion, which is the central gear, is what the minute hand clicks onto. And then down below that you'll see the minute hand on a separate face. Now as I started saying before I really interrupted myself by doing nothing, I'm just going to lubricate the high spots there. Now those high spots are all that hour wheel actually runs on. So you want as few points of contact anyway to keep the friction down. Triangles are strong, and I'm just using a little bit of oil just to keep them going as well. I don't know if graphite or something like that may be a better use here, because this part does actually run under a mild amount of thrust tension. You can see we've got this copper washer going on here. That is indeed a thrust washer, and it's just holding that the hour gear back against those 3 raised dots. And it's on there is to try and keep everything universal. So when you put the face on, the face is touching the spring, and the spring is pushing against the hour wheel, and then it's keeping it all together. And lo and behold, that goes back on, and it's just a case of clipping those tabs back down, and that is it. On a more expensive watch, or a lot of wristwatches, sometimes you have tiny screws down in the side. And I'm saying tiny because they're about 0.8 of a mil, which is, well, some fathom of barleycorns, I'm sure it is, but absolutely tiny amount. So these just fold back over, and then that's the face effectively back on, and that is all that's holding that face in there. There's no tricks, no screws, no nothing. But this is why you want to look after them. So all that's outstanding now is the final little wipe down, just to get me greasy mitt prints off. I could do with some finger cots really, but I'm not too bothered about that just yet, especially on something like this. I say that I keep being a bit unfair towards it really. This is a perfectly fit for purpose timepiece, to be honest with you. I suppose it's just with horology and watchmaking and such like, you get such magnificent pieces like this, which is effectively a simple workhorse. It just doesn't muster up. So I'm being unduly unfair. It is a lovely and precise bit of equipment. But like I say, you ain't gonna land someone on the moon with it. So the minute hand just drops on there, and that is just a friction fit, as indeed is the hour hand. You can get an actual press tool for this, little nylon barrel tips, but I just like to use a little bit of common sense, being nice and calm, and then just press it on with the old tweezers. And the hour hand is the exact same with the minute hand, in that it's just sliding over a shaft, and you just push it and it'll click. Now you see there, I was going to move the old move hand across the dial, but I'm not going to do that with the steel tweezers, because in a fight between steel and aluminium will not win. So I'm just going to use the cut end of a cotton bud here, just to give that a little push so it's perfectly on the 12 there. And that's something which really does bother me when hands on watches aren't aligned. That's one of the things which got me into opening watches. I've got my faithful Omega Speedmaster automatic, which I've had for many years now, and it fell off my wrist and the hands became misaligned. So yeah, I just opened it up. I just opened it up and found out that the watches are actually the watch hands are just a friction fit, and that was easy as that. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm just aligning the hour and the minute hand, so when they're in the middle of 12, midnight, midday, they're absolutely spot on. And as you're probably just about to see very shortly, this was actually nearer to midnight than midday. Now it's just time to put it back in the chassis of the watch. So all we've got to do is effectively line up the slot on the top of there with the slot corresponding to the inside of that crown. Now this looks like it should be easier said than done. It's one of them where you look at it and you think, well, it's a round it's a round peg, and the round hole is smaller, and you give it a play and it's back and forth, and it just doesn't fit. There's no way it's going to fit. And then all of a sudden, you just put it down and it falls in. I'm not sure if that was the factory approved method on working for these, but that's what seems to happen with me. So there you go. And that's just fallen in now. And then it's just these 4 teeny tiny screws, just doing them up. You'll notice across the entire process of this, I've been doing up these screws and I haven't been putting much tension on them at all. They're like a mil big, so you don't want a lot of tension. It is a watch, and compared to many things, it's a precision instrument, so it wants to be nice and fine. Plus, if you ever want to take it apart again, you're going to want to do that. There are very, very few times where you'd use any sort of fixing agent like Loctite or something like that, and that's if it was a screw-in crown. So if you've got a crown on a stem, the actual crown, which is the big knobbly bit which you put your hands on, that's got a bit of Loctite on it for the thread, otherwise it'd just spin clean off. I have had a watch that did that, to be fair, and I thought at the time I was being a cowboy by fixing it with Loctite, so it's nice to know, nice to get that gratifying feeling that I actually did the right thing. So that's those 4 put in there, and I seem to be taking the need to point at the old watch. But yeah, never mind, there we go. So just get these finished up. There's one thing about the Smiths brand which I always liked as well. They always did the clock gauges for Leyland motors. So my lovely Mini that had Smiths clocks in, and well, this one works probably better than those now, to be fair. I'm not sure about that car. It might still be on the road. It was a great car, and it's just one of those cool logos, brands associated with classic cars. I really enjoyed, and it seems to be presenting me some issues putting these 4 screws in. Apparently, they are a bit of a pain, to be fair, because you've got to try and put them through the chassis, then through the face. But now it's time to put this crystal on, and to be honest with you, I was very happy with how it came out. If I was fixing a watch for somebody else, then I'd probably change it. But I think it's just that vintage look, and with how the plating's come off the crown and left it brass, I think just the sort of brown colour which is in that crystal has almost left it looking gold by the time you've put it through that silver. So the silver going through the brown light goes gold, and I think it does give a nice look to it. So I've not attempted to clean up the case whatsoever, because I quite like it looking a little bit battered. Obviously this thing's best part of 70-year-old, so it ought to look best part of a 70-year-old in my opinion. But I just like it. There's certain things that I like. I like a clear crystal, and I like it to actually work. So that's what I'm about. So yeah, there you go. And that's it all back together and ticking. And talking about Speedmaster, that's my Speedmaster there. So what we'll do is I'll wind it up, and then I'll set the time on it, and I think I'm just going to do a mild comparison. You can get proper beat recognising machines, which actually can tell you the impulse of your watch, and they can tell you how many seconds you're gaining or losing in a day. With a pocket watch like this, it's fair enough to lose a minute or so in a day. So you're not really, it sounds silly really, but you're not really too bad. My watch on the right there is my old faithful Omega with its chronograph, which I'm going to be timing against. And yeah, as I say, that gains and loses time depending on the weather, depending on how much I wear it, which is normally all the time. It's just an extension of me, to be honest. So yeah, they gain and lose time all the time. These old fob watches, they're not shock proof. They don't like being changed angle or anything. You've seen the insides of them. There's no crystal, there's friction about it, so if it's warmer, colder, it really does make a hell of a lot of difference. But the whole point of these pocket watches is you are supposed to wind them in the morning, set them to your inside clock, or to the talking clock, whatever, and then you'd be out and about for the day. So by the time you've come home again, you just repeat the process every day. So no matter what, every day it's getting set up, it's being wound, and you're calibrating the time on it. So it only really has to last a day. So if it gains a minute in a day, that's not really the end of the world. So I'm coming back up to 60, and I stop it there. And comparing the two, my watch, which is a calibrated instrument, is indeed a second longer. So it needs to gain some time. But it's only just started running again, and it's going to gain time, I'm sure it is. So I hope you've enjoyed that. That's been the remake of my little old watch. Hopefully it keeps ticking. We'll see.